They thought they knew your ending. That was their first mistake. They glanced at your chapters and assumed the arc, saw your pain and thought you'd drown in it, measured your silence and concluded surrender. They read your kindness as weakness, your loyalty as dependency, your patience as naivete. That's how the world writes people like you. Flat, predictable, safe to discard. But you were never written to be understood by lazy eyes. You were meant to be misread. You were the kind of story that shifts in genre the moment they think they've got it figured out. You weren't a victim. You were the architect of pause. And while they celebrated your fall, you were engineering your rise. Quietly, ruthlessly, without permission. They fed off your predictability, didn't they? Played God with your emotions, confident that you'd stay loyal to the script. Predictable behavior is a playground for manipulators. It offers them a map, but you rip the map in half the moment you realize the game was rigged. You stopped reacting, stopped defending. You didn't need to announce the plot twist. You became it, without theatrics, without applause. You simply shifted, changed your rhythm, walked differently, breathed differently. And the people who once choreographed your story suddenly found themselves standing on a stage with the wrong script. You broke their fourth wall. Now they're stuck in a reality where you're no longer theirs to direct. You know what confuses people more than rage? Indifference. They were ready for confrontation, armed for your pain, prepared to counterattack every outburst. But you gave them nothing, and nothing is terrifying, because it leaves room for imagination, for projection, for the creeping suspicion that maybe, just maybe, you've evolved beyond them. And they were right. You did. While they rehearsed the same old tactics, you rewrote your ending. You chose a plot line they didn't have a role in. You built a climax where your silence was the final monologue. That's what twisted the knife. Not the pain you caused, but the irrelevance you revealed. You became the chapter they can't reread without bleeding. They tell themselves lies now. It's the only thing that lets them sleep. That you got lucky. That you changed. That someone else must have helped you. They can't admit the truth, because the truth steals their last comfort, the illusion of control. The truth is, you did it alone, with trembling hands, with a stitched-together spine. You didn't rise on a stage. You crawled out of a pit, and every ounce of power you now carry was bought with agony, with insight, with self-dissection. They can't handle that version of you, because that version doesn't need them. That version holds the pen, and they were never written into the new pages. They stare at your growth like it's an offense, as if you've betrayed the role they assigned you. Because people don't like watching those they underestimated surpass them. It fractures their worldview, forces them to question their intuition. So they pretend you changed, that you became arrogant, cold, distant, but you didn't change. You just stopped translating yourself for people who spoke in lies. You stopped apologizing for breathing fire after they handed you matches and blamed you for the flames. You stepped off their stage and built your own arena. Now they watch from the cheap seats, wondering how the plot got away from them. You see, the twist wasn't just that you rose. It's how you rose. With grace, with restraint, without seeking revenge. That's what they can't comprehend, because they expected a war. They anticipated your breakdown. What they got was evolution. And evolution isn't loud. It doesn't march. It doesn't beg for recognition. It simply arrives, uninvited, undeniable. Your presence now demands a different kind of attention. The quiet kind. The kind that speaks in glances, in energy, in the sudden discomfort people feel when they realize they can no longer predict your reaction. You've become unreadable, unshakable. And that unreadability, that's what bends their mind. They can't recreate you. That's the sting. They can mimic your voice, your style, your words, but they can't duplicate your depth, because what you carry can't be stolen. It was forged, and they didn't stay for the forging. They left during the fire, abandoned you in your becoming, mocked your stillness, laughed at your slowness, discredited your rebirth. But now they see the result, and it's haunting, because it's better than they imagined. Sharper, braver, more whole. You were the side character in their story, until you stopped showing up. Now, you're the title they can't stop reading. And every time they hear your name, it echoes like a plot twist they weren't smart enough to see coming. You don't owe anyone your blueprint. You don't have to explain the process of metamorphosis to those who only watched the cocoon and called it a grave. Let them think it was sudden. Let them write you off as lucky. Your job was never to make them comfortable. Your role was never to meet expectations. You were born to disrupt, to arrive late in the story and steal the entire narrative. Your aura now carries that twist energy. People feel it before you speak. That sense that nothing will go as planned in your presence, that their lies will collapse, that their power will bend. And that fear, that's the respect they were too arrogant to give freely. Now, they pay it in silence. They didn't lose you to betrayal. They lost you to awakening. You didn't walk away for revenge. You walked away for survival, for expansion, for truth. And that truth now radiates in your posture, your voice, your decisions. It's intoxicating, terrifying, liberating. You've become the story they tell themselves differently depending on who's asking. Sometimes you're the villain, sometimes the mystery, sometimes the lesson. But always, always, you are the twist they replay, the unpredictable act that cracked open their performance and forced them to confront their own script. They didn't see you coming. And now, they'll never be able to look away. They were prepared for a comeback, a loud one, an emotional one, the kind of return that needs an audience, needs vindication, needs a standing ovation to survive. But your reappearance didn't play by their rules. It wasn't made for their approval. It was engineered in silence, not out of spite, but out of focus. You disappeared to rebuild, and they thought that silence was defeat. But you were laying brick by brick, plan by plan, shaping a version of yourself that no longer needed their narrative to survive. So when you stepped back into view, it wasn't with noise, it was with impact. You didn't make a scene, you became one. And the foundation they built to control the story trembled. They remembered you as fragmented, as hesitant, as someone they could predict. They depended on the version of you who questioned your worth, just enough to keep giving. They memorized your insecurities, cataloged your patterns, built their power around your responses. But that version of you was dismantled in the dark. While they assumed silence meant broken, you were reorganizing everything. You weren't fixing cracks. You were demolishing the entire blueprint and designing something new, something unshakable, something dangerous. And when you reappeared, they looked into your eyes, expecting permission, but were met with indifference. That's when the panic set in. Not because you attacked, but because you no longer operated inside the rules they wrote for you. They used to pull strings, say the right things, trigger the guilt, the doubt, the need for closure, and it worked, for a while. But the silence you chose wasn't emptiness. It was war, the quiet kind, the kind that rewires, the kind that recalibrates. You weren't licking wounds, you were analyzing weaknesses, and not just theirs, yours too. You confronted your own flaws like an assassin, sharp, without emotion. And when you emerged, you didn't just return as stronger, you returned as structured. That structure destroyed the illusion they lived in, because illusions can only thrive in chaos. And your new presence, it was precision. You didn't come back to prove anything. You came back to embody everything, every lesson, every scar, every shattered expectation. You weren't trying to be seen anymore. You were the vision. You walked into their world like someone who no longer needed a single thing it offered. And that was the disruption. Because the power they once held wasn't stolen. It became irrelevant. You didn't need to tear them down. Your growth alone made their illusion collapse. Not through confrontation, but through contrast. Their world was built on your old self. But you didn't just grow past it. You outgrew its architecture. They look at you now and search for familiarity. They want to locate the buttons, the levers, the entry points. But everything's been sealed, reinforced, password protected by clarity. Your energy no longer explains itself. It doesn't accommodate, soften, dilute. You don't meet them where they are. You stand where they can't reach. And from that place, every step you take shakes their structure. Not because you're trying to destroy anything, but because your existence dismantles everything they built without your consent. That's what calculated growth does. It doesn't just remove the need for validation, it invalidates their design. They can't figure out how you changed the game. It wasn't louder moves. It wasn't dramatic exits. It was depth. You developed edges, boundaries, a sharpened presence that doesn't blink. You no longer fear being misunderstood because you no longer need to be explained. And that kind of detachment, that's a direct attack on their illusion. Because illusions depend on your participation, on your defending, on your explaining why you deserve decency. But when you stop asking, the illusion breaks. They're left arguing with a ghost of who you used to be, while the real you walks through locked doors without ever looking back. They expected recovery. They never expected reconstruction. And the thing about reconstruction, it doesn't bring back the past. It paves over it. You paved over the moments they weaponized against you. You paved over the softness they exploited. You turned vulnerability into strategy. You converted silence into strength. And now, every time they attempt to repeat the old playbook, they fumble. Because your energy no longer fits the framework they created. It breaks it, effortlessly, without speaking. You don't have to confront the lie anymore. You simply exist outside of it. What they fear now is not what you'll say. It's that you'll never speak again. That they'll never get to explain, manipulate, distort the ending. Because when someone rewrites themselves without you, it means you were never the center of their story. And that's the ego death they suffer in silence. You didn't ruin their reputation. You removed their access. And that absence, that's the final blow. Because it doesn't scream, it doesn't beg, it simply erases. And liars can't recover from erasure. They watch you now like a question they'll never answer. You walk into rooms, and the temperature shifts. Not because you're trying to dominate, but because you carry the absence of weakness. You no longer bleed in public. You no longer fill voids with over-explanations. You show up as a version of yourself that doesn't flinch. And that kind of presence? That's not growth. That's arrival. You became everything they tried to control. And now, their illusion of power crumbles every time your shadow passes by. They cheered for you when you were useful, when your light cast shadows only where it was convenient, when your honesty was gentle, your empathy obedient, your voice just loud enough to help, but never loud enough to challenge. That version of you was palatable. That version was applauded. But when you turned inward, when you stopped diluting yourself for their comfort, they grew uneasy. You didn't change. You revealed. And that revelation, it made them reframe you not as the hero, but as the disruption. They needed someone to blame for the unease your evolution awakened. So they rewrote your role, erased the chapters that praised your presence, and rebranded you as the villain who broke the peace. But what they call peace was always your silent suffering. You were never trying to be a savior. You just didn't want others to drown. But somewhere along the way, they built their balance on your self-abandonment, called your sacrifice strength, called your exhaustion grace. They wrote you as the fixer, the healer, the reliable one, the backbone of their chaos. And when you stopped playing that part, the story collapsed. Not because you failed them, but because their illusion depended on your obedience. That's when the narrative shifted. The hero became ungrateful, cold, harsh, too direct, too aware, too independent. But if being the villain means choosing truth over tolerance, if it means preserving your fire instead of setting yourself on fire for others, then so be it. Play the villain, with pride. The twist isn't that you turned dark. The twist is that you finally stopped apologizing for your duality. You accepted that light, without boundaries blinds, as much as darkness. You became both sun and shadow. And that's where your real power began. Because people want clarity, but they worship control. They want someone who forgives, but also someone who forgets. You chose to remember. You chose to see. And in doing so, you shattered the safety of their version of you. The one who would never walk away. The one who would always understand. The one who would bend until they broke you. That version is gone. And what remains? Uncomfortable clarity wrapped in poise. They talk about you now. Not in gratitude, but in confusion. Because they don't know how to explain what happened without admitting what they did. You don't fit neatly in their script anymore. You're not just the one who cared too much. You're the one who saw too much and walked away too soon for them to flip the ending. So they label you dangerous, too intense, emotionally unavailable. That's their way of saying, we couldn't manipulate you anymore. And you don't deny it. You wear their accusations like trophies, not because you are proud of the pain, but because you are no longer pretending that boundaries are cruelty. You started as the cure and ended as the curse. That's how they see you. That's how most people see those who heal without staying. They wanted your insight, not your independence. They wanted your light, not your lamp. But you refused to be a utility. You refused to be reinserted into a story that fed on your silence. So now, they call your strength self-centered, your solitude selfish, your peace inconvenient. Let them. Their stories are written in chalk. Yours is etched in bone. They may never understand you, but they will never forget you. Because you didn't just escape the script. You burned it. You know now that the best characters are contradictions. That becoming whole, sometimes, means becoming what others fear. And that fear? It tastes like power. Not the egoic kind, but the kind that comes from knowing you don't need to prove your purity anymore. You're not here to be understood. You're here to be complete. You can be merciful and merciless, tender and untouchable, loving and unrelenting, the hero they remember and the villain they can't forget, both born from the same root, truth. And that truth? It owes no explanation, especially to those who only accepted you when you were convenient. The ones who loved your light but denied your shadow never truly loved you. They loved the reflection of themselves they saw in your giving. And when that reflection changed, when you stopped handing out forgiveness like candy, they called you cruel. But cruelty isn't telling the truth. Cruelty is expecting someone to live a lie so you can sleep better at night. You stopped doing that. You stopped being their sleep aid. And now, they toss and turn in the silence you left behind, wondering what version of you is out there now, wondering if they ever truly knew you. The answer is no. They only knew who you were forced to be when you were surviving. Your villainy was never about destruction. It was about defiance, defying their timeline, their expectations, their edited history of events. You chose to tell the story as it was, not as they wished it to be. And in that act of defiance, you reclaimed every piece of yourself they tried to narrate. That's what it means to become both, to be the storm and the shelter, the knife and the healer. You didn't lose your heart. You just stopped bleeding for people who laughed while you bled. And that shift turned the page, made you the unexpected ending, the line they didn't see coming. They needed you to be predictable. Understand this. People don't fear pain. They fear uncertainty. Pain has a rhythm. It has rules. But unpredictability, that shakes the entire nervous system. You weren't just a person in their life. You were a pattern, the dependable one, the quiet one, the forgiver, the empath who flinched before raising their voice. They built a throne of control on top of your consistency. And then one day, you shattered the frame. You responded differently. You paused instead of defending. You walked instead of explaining. And the moment you broke the pattern, their judgment cracked with it. Now every memory of you is unstable. Was the kindness manipulation? Was the silence resentment? Was your loyalty a mirror they never bothered to look into? They never planned for your evolution. They weren't worried about who you might become, because they thought they had mapped your emotional terrain. You were their fixed variable, the one they could always bet would react the same. But humans forget. Patterns are only comfortable until they're used against you. You played your role until it became a weapon in their hands. And then you left the stage. Not by slamming the door, by vanishing from the scene they wrote you into. That exit? It wasn't loud, but it was destructive. Because it didn't end with a scream. It ended with a question. And questions are more dangerous than conclusions. Now they stare at the ceiling, replaying it all, trying to find the fracture, the moment the pattern shifted. Their mind turns into a crime scene. Evidence spread everywhere, but no clear motive. Because they expected the same emotional script, same tone, same timing, same you. But what they got was the psychological equivalent of a detonation. One you didn't broadcast, one you calculated. You didn't seek revenge. You left inconsistently, left with your silence weaponized, left without the punctuation of closure. And now, their brain, so wired to expect rhythm, replays the rupture again and again, trying to build a new map around a landscape that no longer exists. You unmoored their certainty, not because you lied, but because you told a truth they weren't prepared to receive. You shattered the idea of who you were, and now they question everyone. That's the infection of pattern disruption. It doesn't just taint the past, it recolors the present. Now every person who acts like you used to feels suspect. Every kind word has a shadow. Every loyal gesture carries weight. Because you've exposed a flaw in their code, that no pattern is permanent. And that insight, that devastates. Because it means the world is not as legible as they once believed. What unnerves them isn't just that you changed, it's that you could. They thought your identity was static, that it served their comfort, that it would never turn its gaze inward. But then came the shift. The moment your words had new structure,